I was sitting in my home office in Scottsdale, Arizona, responding to emails on a lazy Saturday morning when I heard the shrill sound of my doorbell being pressed repeatedly. Not just once or twice, but 7 times in rapid succession, like someone was trying to play a drum solo on the button. I pushed back from my desk, already feeling the first stirrings of irritation, and walked to the front door. Through the frosted glass panel, I could see the silhouette of someone standing with their hands on their hips, a posture I'd learned to recognize over the years as the universal stance of impending confrontation. When I opened the door, I was greeted by a woman in her mid-50s with an aggressively blonde bob haircut, wearing a crisp white polo shirt with the Sunset Hills HOA logo embroidered on the breast pocket. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, and her eyes were already narrowed behind her designer sunglasses, which she wore despite standing in the shade of my covered porch. "Vincent Oakes?" she demanded, not asked. "That's me," I said, keeping my tone neutral. After 20 years practicing real estate law, I'd developed a decent radar for trouble, and this woman was setting off every alarm bell in my head. "I'm Brenda Morrison, president of the Sunset Hills Homeowners Association Board. We need to discuss several serious violations you've committed." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. "Violations? I've lived here for 3 months. What violations?" She pulled out a tablet from the large designer purse hanging from her shoulder and swiped through it with manicured nails painted a violent shade of coral. "First, your front yard landscaping is non-compliant. The HOA covenants clearly state that all desert landscaping must include a minimum of 3 agave plants. You only have 2. I blinked at her. "You're here about agave plants." "That's just the beginning," Brenda continued, her voice rising slightly. "Your garage door was left open past 8 p.m. last Thursday evening. That's a direct violation of Section 7, Paragraph 3 of our community standards. Additionally, your trash cans were visible from the street on a non-collection day last week. And most egregiously, you've painted your front door without obtaining prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee." "The door was that color when I bought the house," I pointed out. "Then you should have repainted it to an approved color within 30 days of closing, as stated in the welcome packet." She tapped her tablet screen with unnecessary force. "I'm here to inform you that you're being fined $500 for these violations, and you have 14 days to remedy all issues or face additional penalties." I took a deep breath, reminding myself that I was trying to enjoy retirement from my law practice. I'd moved to Scottsdale specifically to get away from constant conflict and stress. "Brenda, I think we can work this out reasonably. I wasn't aware of some of these rules, and honestly, they seem pretty excessive for minor issues." "Rules are rules, Mr. Oakes," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "If everyone just did whatever they wanted, this community would fall apart. I'll be sending you a formal notice via certified mail. Good day." She turned on her heel and marched back down my walkway, leaving me standing in the doorway, simultaneously amused and annoyed. I'd dealt with plenty of difficult people in my career, but HOA zealots were a special breed. Still, I figured I'd just fix the issues and move on. It wasn't worth the fight. That was my first mistake. The certified letter arrived 3 days later, and it was even more absurd than our conversation. The fine had somehow increased to $750, with an additional list of violations I hadn't even heard about during Brenda's visit. Apparently, my mailbox was 0.3 inches too far from the curb. According to their latest measurements, my house numbers weren't the approved font style, and I'd been seen walking my dog past 9 p.m., which violated the community's quiet hours policy. I sat at my kitchen table, reading through the 8-page document with growing disbelief. The letter was written in the most aggressive legal language possible, threatening liens, foreclosure, and legal action if I didn't comply immediately and pay the fine within 10 days. What really caught my attention, though, was the signature at the bottom. It wasn't just from Brenda Morrison as HOA president, it was also signed by Patricia Dennison, listed as the HOA's legal counsel. I knew Patricia Dennison. We'd crossed paths several times in court over the years, and she was about as competent as a first-year law student who'd slept through most of their classes. The fact that the HOA had hired her told me everything I needed to know about the quality of legal advice they were receiving. I pulled out my laptop and started doing what I did best, researching. I downloaded the complete HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions from the county recorder's office, along with all the amendments that had been filed over the years. I also pulled up the Arizona Planned Communities Act, which governed HOA operations in the state. Then I started reading. 4 hours later, I had filled an entire legal pad with notes. The situation was even worse than I'd thought, but not for me. The HOA had been operating in violation of state law in at least 15 different ways. Their fine schedule hadn't been properly approved according to their own bylaws. They'd made amendments to the CCRs without the required homeowner vote. They hadn't held properly noticed annual meetings for the past 3 years. And most importantly for my immediate situation, at least half of the violations they'd cited me for weren't actually in the recorded covenants at all. Brenda and her board had apparently just been making up rules as they went along. I spent the next 2 days drafting a response. I kept it professional but firm, pointing out that the violations they'd cited were either non-existent or improperly enacted, that their fine schedule was unenforceable, and that they needed to withdraw the fines immediately. I also politely suggested that they might want to review their operations with competent legal counsel to ensure they were in compliance with state law. I sent the letter via email and certified mail, copying Patricia Dennison, and then I waited. The response came faster than I expected. 2 days later, Brenda was back on my doorstep, this time with 2 other board members in tow. One was a thin, nervous-looking man in his 60s who kept fidgeting with his phone. The other was a heavy-set woman with steel gray hair who looked like she could bench press a small car. "Mr. Oakes," Brenda said, her voice tight with barely controlled rage, "your letter was extremely inappropriate and insulting. The HOA board operates under proper authority, and we don't appreciate you attempting to intimidate us with legal jargon." "I wasn't trying to intimidate anyone," I said calmly. "I was pointing out legitimate legal issues with your enforcement actions." "Are you a lawyer?" the nervous man asked suddenly. "I am. Well, I was. I retired 3 months ago after 20 years practicing real estate law in Phoenix, specialized in community association law, actually." The color drained from Brenda's face, but only for a moment. She recovered quickly, her expression hardening. "That doesn't change anything. You're still in violation of community standards, and you're still required to pay the fines." "Actually, it changes quite a bit," I said, "because those community standards you're citing don't exist in the recorded CCRs, which means they're not enforceable. Your fine schedule was never properly approved according to your own bylaws, and you've been operating the HOA in violation of state law for years." "That's ridiculous," Brenda snapped. "We have legal counsel who reviews everything we do." "Patricia Dennison?" I asked. "Yeah, she's not very good at her job. If she were, she would have told you that you can't just make up rules without following the proper amendment process. She also would have told you that you're required to hold annual meetings with properly posted notice, which you haven't done since 2022. The heavy-set woman spoke up for the first time, her voice surprisingly soft. "Brenda, maybe we should table this and have Patricia review the situation." "We don't need to review anything," Brenda said, her voice rising. "This is just another entitled homeowner trying to get out of following the rules. We deal with people like this all the time." "No, you really don't," I said, my patience starting to wear thin, "because most people don't know their rights or don't want the hassle of fighting back. But I'm not most people. I'm telling you right now, withdraw the fines and stop with the harassment, or this is going to get very expensive for the HOA." Brenda stepped closer, invading my personal space in a way that was clearly meant to be intimidating. "Are you threatening us, Mr. Oakes?" "I'm informing you of the consequences of your illegal actions," I replied, not backing down. "There's a difference." "We'll see you in court," she said, then turned and stormed off, her board members hurrying after her. I closed the door and let out a long breath. I really hadn't wanted it to come to this. I'd moved to Scottsdale to relax, to play golf, to enjoy my retirement. Instead, I was apparently going to war with my HOA. The next escalation came a week later. I received another certified letter, this time informing me that the fine had increased to $1,500 due to my continued noncompliance and insubordination to the board. They'd also added new violations, including the claim that I was running a business from my home, which was supposedly prohibited. That one made me laugh out loud. The only work I'd done from home was checking emails from my old firm, where I still maintained a consulting relationship. I wasn't seeing clients, I wasn't advertising services, and I certainly wasn't operating a business. But Brenda had apparently seen my car in the driveway during business hours and decided I must be running some kind of illegal operation. The letter also informed me that if I didn't pay the fine within 5 days, they would file a lien against my property. That was the line they shouldn't have crossed. I spent the rest of that day drafting a lawsuit, not just a response to their claims, but an affirmative action against the HOA, Brenda Morrison personally, and Patricia Dennison for her role in advising these illegal actions. I claimed abuse of power, harassment, violations of the Arizona Planned Communities Act, breach of fiduciary duty, and a few other causes of action that I knew would make their insurance company very nervous. I also drafted a motion for a temporary restraining order to prevent them from filing the lien and a demand for an independent audit of the HOA's finances. In my years of practice, I'd learned that dysfunctional HOA boards usually had financial irregularities to match their procedural violations. Before I filed anything, though, I decided to give them one more chance. I sent a detailed letter explaining exactly what I was prepared to do, what it would cost them in legal fees, and what I expected to find when the HOA's operations were put under a microscope. I gave them 72 hours to withdraw all fines and agree to bring the HOA into compliance with state law. I got my answer in less than 24 hours, but not in the form I expected. I was in my garage, working on organizing some boxes I still hadn't unpacked from the move, when a Scottsdale police cruiser pulled into my driveway. My first thought was that something had happened in the neighborhood, but then I saw Brenda's car parked across the street, and I knew exactly what was going on. The officer who approached was young, probably in his late 20s, with the kind of earnest expression that suggested he still believed he could solve every problem. "Mr. Oakes?" "That's me," I said, wiping dust off my hands. "We received a report that you've been harassing members of the HOA board and making threats. I need to ask you a few questions." I took a deep breath, reminding myself that this officer was just doing his job. "Officer, I haven't harassed or threatened anyone. I've been defending myself against illegal actions by the HOA board. The complainant says you told them you would make them pay and that you would destroy them in court. I said I would sue them if they continued to violate my rights in state law," I corrected. "That's not a threat. That's a statement of intent to pursue legal remedies. There's a significant difference." The officer looked uncertain, which was a good sign. She seemed pretty upset. "Said you've been sending intimidating letters." "I've been sending letters explaining the legal problems with their actions," I said. "I'm an attorney, or I was before I retired. Real estate law was my specialty. The HOA has been operating illegally for years, and when I pointed that out, the president decided to escalate instead of fixing the problems." "So, you are a lawyer?" "I am, though I'm not currently practicing. Look, officer, I understand you have to respond to complaints, but this is clearly a civil dispute. The HOA board is trying to use the police to intimidate me because they know they don't have a legal leg to stand on." The officer glanced back at his cruiser, then at Brenda's car across the street. "All right, Mr. Oakes, I'll note in my report that this appears to be a civil matter, but I'd suggest you try to work this out without any more heated exchanges." "That's exactly what I've been trying to do," I said, "but they keep escalating." After the officer left, I watched Brenda pull away from the curb, her face tight with frustration. She'd tried to get me arrested or at least intimidated, and it had failed. But it also told me just how far she was willing to go to avoid admitting she was wrong. That afternoon, I filed my lawsuit. The next 2 weeks were relatively quiet. I knew the HOA had been served with my complaint because I got confirmation from the process server. I also knew they were probably scrambling because Patricia Dennison filed a motion to dismiss that was so poorly written, it would have been funny if it wasn't representing the HOA's defense strategy. Then I got a call from my next-door neighbor, an elderly man named Richard, who I'd chatted with a few times over the fence. "Vincent, I thought you should know that Brenda came by today asking questions about you. Wanted to know if you had loud parties, if your dog barked all the time, if you'd done anything suspicious." "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her you were the quietest neighbor I'd had in 20 years and that she should leave you alone. Richard said with a chuckle. "But she's going around to everyone on the street. I think she's trying to build some kind of case against you." "Thanks for letting me know, Richard. I appreciate it." That evening, 3 more neighbors stopped by or called to tell me similar stories. Brenda was on a campaign to dig up dirt on me, apparently hoping to find something, anything she could use to justify her actions. The problem was that I'd been a model resident. I kept my property maintained. I was quiet. I followed the actual rules that were legitimately in the CCRs, and I was friendly with everyone I met. Her campaign was backfiring spectacularly. Instead of turning the neighborhood against me, she was turning them against herself. The preliminary injunction hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks after I filed the lawsuit. I showed up at the Maricopa County Superior Court with 2 banker's boxes full of evidence and a trial notebook that would have made my old law partners proud. Patricia Dennison showed up with a single folder and an expression that suggested she'd only read my complaint the night before. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Karren Steinberg, had a reputation for not suffering fools gladly. I'd appeared before her a few times over the years and knew she valued preparation and clear arguments. "Mr. Oakes," Judge Steinberg said after we'd been called to order, "you're representing yourself in this matter?" "I am, Your Honor. I practiced real estate law for 20 years before retiring, and I'm comfortable handling my own case in this instance." "Very well. Ms. Dennison, you're representing the Sunset Hills HOA, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Patricia said, standing up so quickly she nearly knocked over her water glass. "Mr. Oakes, you're seeking a preliminary injunction preventing the HOA from filing a lien against your property, along with several other provisions. Please proceed." I spent the next 30 minutes laying out my case. I showed how the HOA had cited me for violations that didn't exist in the recorded CCRs. I demonstrated that their fine schedule had never been properly approved. I walked through their violations of the Arizona Planned Communities Act, including the failure to hold annual meetings, improper notice procedures, and unauthorized amendments to the governing documents. I also presented evidence of Brenda's harassment campaign, including statements from my neighbors and the police report from her attempt to have me arrested. Judge Steinberg listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Patricia Dennison objected a few times, but her objections were poorly timed and easily overruled. When it was Patricia's turn to argue, she stood up and immediately went on the defensive. "Your Honor, Mr. Oakes is simply a disgruntled homeowner who doesn't want to follow the rules. Every community has standards, and we have the right to enforce them." "Ms. Dennison," Judge Steinberg interrupted, "has the HOA held annual meetings for the past 3 years as required by statute?" Patricia hesitated. "Well, Your Honor, we've had board meetings." "That's not what I asked. Have you held annual membership meetings with all homeowners invited?" "The board represents the homeowners, Your Honor. We meet regularly." "That's a no then," Judge Steinberg said, making a note. "What about the fine schedule that Mr. Oakes was cited under? Was it properly approved according to the HOA's bylaws?" Another hesitation. "The board has the authority to set fines." "Does the board have the authority to set fines without following the amendment procedures in the bylaws?" the judge pressed. "I would need to review the specific language," Patricia admitted. Judge Steinberg leaned back in her chair. "Ms. Dennison, I've read Mr. Oakes's complaint and supporting documents. The legal issues he's raised are significant and well-founded. Unless you have evidence that contradicts his claims, I'm prepared to rule on the motion today." "Your Honor, if I could have a continuance to prepare a more thorough response." "Motion for continuance denied," Judge Steinberg said firmly. "You've had 3 weeks to prepare for this hearing. Mr. Oakes has presented clear evidence of statutory violations and improper procedures. The burden is on you to show that the HOA has acted properly, and you haven't done that." She turned to her computer and began typing. After a moment, she looked up. "The court grants Mr. Oakes's motion for preliminary injunction. The HOA is prohibited from filing any liens against Mr. Oakes's property, from imposing any further fines, and from taking any enforcement actions until this matter is resolved. Additionally, the court orders the HOA to hold a properly noticed annual meeting within 60 days and to provide all homeowners with complete financial disclosures for the past 3 years. The HOA shall also hire an independent management company to review their operations and ensure compliance with state law. Patricia looked like she'd been slapped. Your Honor, that's extraordinarily burdensome for the HOA. Then the HOA should have been following the law from the beginning, Judge Steinberg replied. Anything else, Mr. Oakes? Just that I'm requesting attorney's fees and costs, Your Honor. As a pro se litigant with a law license, I'm entitled to recover fees based on reasonable attorney rates. Granted, subject to proper documentation, this hearing is adjourned. I packed up my boxes and headed out of the courtroom, feeling the first real satisfaction I'd had since this whole mess started. Patricia caught up with me in the hallway, looking flustered. Vincent, we should talk about settling this case. I'm open to reasonable settlement discussions, I said. But the first step is that Brenda Morrison needs to step down from the board. She's the source of most of these problems, and the HOA can't fix itself while she's still in charge. You can't demand that someone resign from an elected position, Patricia protested. I'm not demanding anything, I said. I'm telling you what it would take for me to consider dismissing my lawsuit. Otherwise, we can continue to trial, and I'll add a claim for damages based on harassment and abuse of process. Your choice. I left her standing in the hallway and drove home, wondering how Brenda was going to react to the judge's order. I didn't have to wait long to find out. The HOA held an emergency board meeting that evening. I knew about it because Richard called to tell me that Brenda was going door to door, telling people that I had filed a frivolous lawsuit that was going to cost the HOA tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees, all because I didn't want to follow simple rules about agave plants. I decided to attend the meeting. The bylaws required that all board meetings be open to homeowners, even though the HOA had been ignoring that rule. I showed up at the community center where they held their meetings, carrying a copy of Judge Steinberg's order. The look on Brenda's face when I walked in was priceless. She was standing at the front of the room with the other board members, addressing maybe 20 homeowners who had shown up. She stopped mid-sentence and pointed at me. You are not welcome here. Actually, I am, I said calmly, taking a seat in the back row. Arizona law requires that all HOA board meetings be open to homeowners. It's in the statute and in your bylaws. This is a closed session, Brenda insisted. Then you need to cite the specific reason for closing the session as allowed by statute, I said. And you need to do it properly, which means going into closed session after the open portion of the meeting, not before. Several homeowners turned to look at me with interest. An older woman in the front row raised her hand. Who are you? Vincent Oakes. I live on Desert Willow Drive. I'm the person Mrs. Morrison has been telling you about. The one with the lawsuit? Another homeowner asked. That's right. And I'd like to explain what that lawsuit is actually about, if Mrs. Morrison doesn't mind. Brenda's face turned an interesting shade of red. You have no right to disrupt this meeting. I'm not disrupting anything, I said. But since you're talking about me and my lawsuit, I think it's only fair that I get to present the actual facts, unless you'd prefer to continue spreading misinformation. The nervous board member from before, who I'd learned was named Dennis, spoke up. Maybe we should let him speak, Brenda. I mean, we are talking about his case. Brenda looked like she wanted to argue, but she must have realized she was losing the room. Fine. 5 minutes. I stood up and walked to the front, pulling out my copy of the court order. Here's what actually happened. The HOA cited me for multiple violations. When I reviewed the governing documents, I discovered that most of those violations weren't actually in the recorded CCRs. They were rules that the board had made up without following the proper amendment procedures. I also discovered that the HOA hasn't held a proper annual meeting since 2022, which is a violation of state law. When I pointed these issues out, Mrs. Morrison increased my fines and threatened to place a lien on my property. So I filed a lawsuit, and today, a judge agreed with me. She issued an order preventing the HOA from filing any liens against my property and requiring the HOA to hold a proper annual meeting and provide financial disclosures. That's a biased interpretation, Brenda snapped. It's literally what the judge ordered, I said, holding up the document. Anyone who wants to read it is welcome to come up here and look at it. Several people did exactly that. As they crowded around to read the order, I could see their expressions change from skeptical to concerned to angry. Wait, the older woman from the front row said. We haven't had annual meetings? How's that possible? The board has been operating without proper oversight, I explained, which is part of why these problems developed. When there's no accountability, boards sometimes start to believe they have unlimited authority. This is ridiculous, Brenda said. We've been protecting property values and maintaining community standards. That's our job. Your job is to follow the law and the governing documents, I corrected, and you haven't been doing that. A man in his 40s stood up from the middle of the room. I got cited for having the wrong color of rocks in my landscaping last year. Cost me $800 in fines. Was that even a real rule? I glanced at Brenda, who remained silent. I'd need to review the specific citation, but if it's not in the recorded CCRs, then no, it wasn't a legitimate rule. The room erupted in conversation. It turned out that nearly everyone present had been fined for something at one point or another, and they were all starting to wonder whether those fines had been legitimate. Brenda tried to regain control of the meeting, but she'd lost the room completely. Dennis, the nervous board member, finally stood up and cleared his throat. Brenda, I think we need to discuss this situation. Maybe we should meet with Mr. Oakes privately and see if we can resolve things. There's nothing to resolve, Brenda insisted. He's trying to undermine the board's authority. No, I said quietly. I'm trying to make sure the board operates legally. There's a difference. The meeting devolved into chaos after that. Homeowners started demanding answers about their own fines, asking why they hadn't been told about the problems with the HOA's operations, and questioning whether the board should be replaced entirely. Brenda tried to shut down the meeting, but people refused to leave. I slipped out after about an hour, feeling like maybe things were starting to turn in the right direction. If the homeowners themselves demanded change, it would be much easier to get the HOA back on track. The next morning, I received an email from Dennis. He asked if I would be willing to meet with him and the other 2 board members, without Brenda present, to discuss potential solutions. I agreed, and we set up a meeting for the following afternoon at a local coffee shop. Dennis showed up with Martha, the heavy-set woman with the steel-gray hair. She looked exhausted. Mr. Oakes, thank you for meeting with us. Call me Vincent, I said as we sat down at a corner table. And thank you for reaching out. We need to fix this situation, Martha said without preamble. I've been on the board for 4 years, and I've watched Brenda become more and more controlling. I went along with it because I thought she knew what she was doing, but after reading that judge's order and hearing you explain things last night, I realize we've been completely out of line. Dennis nodded. I'm an accountant, not a lawyer, so I didn't understand half of what was in the governing documents. I trusted Patricia to guide us, but clearly that was a mistake. Patricia is not a competent HOA attorney, I said bluntly. I'm not sure why you hired her. She's Brenda's sister-in-law, Martha admitted. Brenda insisted on hiring her about 2 years ago when our previous attorney retired. That explained a lot. Okay, so let's talk about solutions. First, you need to replace Patricia with competent legal counsel immediately. Second, the HOA needs to comply with Judge Steinberg's order, which means holding an annual meeting and providing financial disclosures. Third, you need to review every fine that's been issued in the past 3 years and refund any that were based on improper rules. That could be hundreds of thousands of dollars, Dennis said, looking pale. It could be, I agreed, but it's better than having multiple homeowners sue you, which is probably what's going to happen once word gets out about the problems with your enforcement actions. The HOA has liability insurance, right? Yes, but I don't know if it covers this kind of thing, Martha said. You need to notify your insurance carrier immediately, I told them. They need to know about the lawsuit and the potential for additional claims. They'll probably assign their own attorney to defend the HOA, which would actually be better than Patricia. What about Brenda? Dennis asked. She's not going to go along with any of this. Then you need to remove her from the board, I said. Look, I know she was elected by the homeowners, but the bylaws almost certainly have provisions for removing board members for cause. Failing to comply with statutory requirements and exposing the HOA to legal liability is definitely cause. Martha and Dennis exchanged glances. We'll talk to the rest of the board, Martha said, but I think you're right. This has gone too far. Over the next few days, things moved quickly. Martha called an emergency board meeting and put forward a motion to remove Brenda Morrison as president and as a board member based on her failure to fulfill her fiduciary duties. The vote was 3-1, with only Brenda voting against her own removal. Brenda did not go quietly. She showed up at the meeting with her own attorney, not Patricia this time, and threatened to sue the board for wrongful termination. Her attorney was actually competent, which made things slightly more complicated, but not enough to change the outcome. The board had documentation of all the violations that had occurred under Brenda's leadership, along with evidence of her harassment campaign against me and her attempt to have me falsely arrested. After a heated 2-hour meeting, Brenda was removed from the board. She stormed out, shouting that she would sue everyone involved and that the community would fall apart without her leadership. The HOA immediately hired a new attorney, a woman named Susan Chen, who specialized in community association law and had a stellar reputation. Her first act was to reach out to me about settling my lawsuit. We met at her office in Phoenix, and I was impressed by her preparation. She had already reviewed all the documentation, identified the problems, and developed a plan to fix them. Mr. Oakes, the HOA wants to resolve this matter as quickly and fairly as possible. We're prepared to offer a full refund of any fines you were assessed, plus your attorney's fees and costs. We'll also include a written apology and an agreement that no further enforcement action will be taken against you for any of the alleged violations. That's a start, I said. But what about the other homeowners who were improperly fined? We're conducting a comprehensive review of all enforcement actions from the past 3 years, Susan said. Any fines that were based on rules not in the recorded CCRs will be refunded. We're also implementing new procedures to ensure this doesn't happen again. And what about Brenda Morrison? Is there going to be any accountability for her actions? Susan hesitated. That's more complicated. The HOA could potentially pursue claims against her for breach of fiduciary duty, but that would require approval from the homeowners. I want her held accountable, I said firmly. She didn't just violate HOA rules. She attempted to have me falsely arrested. She conducted a harassment campaign against me. She exposed the HOA to massive liability through her illegal actions. There need to be consequences. I understand your position, Susan said. Let me discuss this with the board. In the meantime, are you willing to dismiss your lawsuit if we meet your other terms? I'll dismiss the lawsuit against the HOA itself, I said. But I'm keeping my claims against Brenda Morrison personally and against Patricia Dennison for her role in this. They don't get to walk away without consequences. Susan nodded. That's fair. I'll draw up a settlement agreement and get back to you within a week. The settlement with the HOA was finalized 2 weeks later. I received a check for $8,000, covering the fines they'd assessed, my attorney's fees calculated at my prior hourly rate, and a nominal amount for the harassment I'd endured. The HOA also sent a written apology and agreed to never take enforcement action against me for any of the violations Brenda had cited. But I wasn't done. I continued my lawsuit against Brenda Morrison personally and against Patricia Dennison. That case took longer to resolve, but it was worth the effort. During discovery, I learned some very interesting things about Brenda's tenure as HOA president. She'd been using HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, including meals, travel, and even home renovations, by disguising them as community improvement costs. The total amount of misappropriated funds was over $60,000. I immediately contacted the Scottsdale Police Department and provided them with all the documentation I'd gathered through discovery. Financial crimes detectives opened an investigation, and within a month, Brenda was arrested and charged with theft and fraud. Patricia Dennison avoided criminal charges, but she was facing a malpractice lawsuit from the HOA for her failure to properly advise the board and for the conflict of interest created by her family relationship with Brenda. Her insurance carrier settled quickly, and I heard through the legal community grapevine that her practice never recovered from the scandal. The HOA held its required annual meeting in August, and I attended along with most of the 230 homeowners in Sunset Hills. Martha was elected as the new board president, and the homeowners approved a complete overhaul of the HOA's operations, including hiring a professional management company and bringing all the governing documents into compliance with state law. During the meeting, several homeowners stood up to thank me for exposing the problems and forcing the changes. One elderly woman told me that Brenda had fined her $3,000 over a 2-year period for various alleged violations, and she'd paid them because she didn't know she could fight back. She was getting a full refund. A younger couple shared that they'd almost sold their house and moved because they couldn't deal with the constant harassment from the HOA. Now they were planning to stay. Richard, my next-door neighbor, gave a speech about how HOAs were supposed to serve homeowners, not rule over them with an iron fist, and how people like Brenda Morrison gave community associations a bad name. He received a standing ovation. Brenda's criminal case went to trial in November. I was called as a witness to testify about her harassment campaign against me and the context in which the financial irregularities were discovered. The prosecutor used my documentation as a roadmap for proving the theft charges. The trial lasted 3 days. Brenda's defense was that she'd been acting in the HOA's best interests and that any personal expenses had been legitimate business costs. The jury didn't buy it. They convicted her on 4 counts of theft and 2 counts of fraud. At sentencing, the judge was not sympathetic. Mrs. Morrison, you held a position of trust within your community. Homeowners elected you to protect their interests and manage their collective resources responsibly. Instead, you abused that trust for personal gain, harassed residents who questioned your authority, and attempted to use law enforcement to intimidate someone who was simply standing up for their rights. This court takes such violations very seriously. She sentenced Brenda to 18 months in county jail and ordered her to pay full restitution to the HOA, plus penalties and interest. The sentence sent a message that HOA board members couldn't act with impunity. My personal lawsuit against Brenda settled shortly after her conviction. Her homeowner's insurance policy had a provision covering her actions as an HOA board member, and the insurance company paid out $250,000 to settle my claims for harassment, abuse of process, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I donated most of it to a local legal aid organization that helped homeowners fight back against abusive HOAs. By the time everything was resolved, nearly a year had passed since Brenda had first shown up on my doorstep to complain about agave plants. The Sunset Hills HOA was now running smoothly under new leadership with proper procedures and genuine respect for homeowners' rights. Property values were actually up, which demolished Brenda's argument that strict enforcement was necessary to maintain the community. I finally got to enjoy my retirement. I played golf 3 times a week, traveled with friends, and only took on occasional consulting work when it interested me. But I also became something of a local legend among homeowners throughout the Phoenix area who were dealing with HOA issues. I got calls and emails regularly from people asking for advice on how to fight back against abusive enforcement. I helped when I could, sometimes with formal legal advice and sometimes just with guidance on how to navigate the system. I discovered that there were a lot of Brendas out there, petty tyrants who viewed their position on an HOA board as a license to control their neighbors' lives. But there were also a lot of good people who just needed someone to show them that they didn't have to put up with it. One afternoon, about 15 months after the whole situation started, I was sitting on my back patio with a cold drink, watching the sunset over the desert, when my phone rang. It was Martha from the HOA board. "Vincent, I hope I'm not bothering you," she said. "Not at all. What's up?" "We're having our annual meeting next month, and the board would like to do something special to recognize your contributions to the community. Would you be willing to accept an award?" I laughed. "Martha, I didn't do anything special. I just stood up for my rights." "That's exactly the point," she said. "You showed everyone in this community that we have rights and that we don't have to accept abuse from people in authority. You changed the whole culture here. People feel like they can speak up now, like they have a voice. That's worth recognizing." I thought about it for a moment. "All right, I'll accept, but only if you promise not to make a big deal out of it." "I promise," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. The annual meeting was well attended again, which apparently had become the norm since the previous year's dramatic changes. Martha gave a brief speech about the importance of accountability and transparency in community governance, then called me up to the front. "Vincent Oakes could have just paid the fines and moved on," she told the room. "He could have decided that fighting back wasn't worth the hassle. But instead, he stood up for what was right, not just for himself, but for all of us. Because of his actions, We recovered over $60,000 in misappropriated funds, refunded improper fines to dozens of homeowners, and completely reformed how this HOA operates. On behalf of the board and the entire community, thank you. She handed me a plaque with a nice inscription about community service and dedication. It was a simple gesture, but it meant a lot. These people understood what I'd been trying to accomplish, and they appreciated it. After the meeting, at least a dozen homeowners came up to shake my hand and tell me their own stories about how the changes had affected them. One man said he'd been thinking about filing for bankruptcy because of accumulated HOA fines and legal fees from fighting Brenda's enforcement actions. Now those fines had been refunded and he was back on solid financial ground. A woman told me that she'd been afraid to use her own backyard because Brenda had threatened to fine her if she installed a patio cover without approval. Now she had her patio cover properly approved through a reasonable process, and she actually enjoyed her outdoor space. These were real people whose lives had been genuinely improved by holding one abusive HOA president accountable. That mattered more than any legal victory or financial settlement. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the whole experience. I'd moved to Scottsdale looking for peace and quiet, and instead, I'd ended up in the biggest fight of my career. But it had been worth it. Not just for me, but for everyone in Sunset Hills who would benefit from a properly run HOA going forward. The irony wasn't lost on me that Brenda had picked a fight with probably the one person in the community most qualified to fight back. If I'd been a teacher or an accountant or a retired engineer, I might not have known my rights or how to enforce them. She'd gotten unlucky, and her own arrogance and refusal to back down had turned a minor dispute into a complete disaster for her. I kept the plaque on my office wall, not because I was particularly proud of the recognition, but because it reminded me why I'd spent 20 years practicing law in the first place. It wasn't about winning cases or making money or building a reputation. It was about standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves, about fighting against abuse of power, about making sure the system worked the way it was supposed to work. Even in retirement, apparently, I couldn't completely escape that calling. A few months later, I was contacted by a reporter from the Arizona Republic who was writing a story about HOA abuse and reform efforts. She'd heard about the Sunset Hills situation and wanted to interview me. I agreed, figuring that maybe telling my story would help other people in similar situations. The article ran on the front page of the local section with the headline, "Retired Attorney Takes on HOA Tyrant, Sparks Statewide Reform Movement." It detailed Brenda's abuses, my lawsuit, her criminal conviction, and the reforms that had been implemented at Sunset Hills. But it also included information about other HOA abuse cases around Arizona, and quoted several state legislators who were now proposing reforms to the Planned Communities Act to prevent similar situations. The article went viral, at least by local news standards. I started getting calls from reporters in other states, from homeowners' rights organizations, and from attorneys who specialized in community association law. Everyone wanted to know the details of how I'd fought back and won. I gave a few more interviews, always emphasizing that the key was knowing your rights and being willing to stand up for them. I also stressed that most HOA board members were good people trying to do their best for their communities, but that the system needed better checks and balances to prevent the few bad actors from causing harm. Some good actually came out of the media attention. The Arizona legislature passed a new law requiring HOAs to provide homeowners with detailed information about their rights when they moved in, including how to challenge enforcement actions and file complaints with the state. They also increased penalties for HOA board members who violated their fiduciary duties and made it easier for homeowners to remove abusive board members. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was progress. As for me, I settled back into retirement for real this time. I joined the board of the legal aid organization I donated to, helping them develop resources for homeowners dealing with HOA issues. I also taught a few seminars for new HOA board members about their legal obligations and the importance of following proper procedures. But mostly, I just enjoyed my house, my community, and my freedom from dealing with people like Brenda Morrison on a daily basis. Every once in a while, I'd drive past the community center where those contentious board meetings had been held, and I'd smile, remembering the look on Brenda's face when she realized she'd picked a fight with someone who actually knew what they were doing. It had been immensely satisfying to watch her entire house of cards collapse, not because I was vindictive, but because she'd genuinely hurt people and needed to be stopped. Justice, I'd learned over my 20-year career, didn't always come quickly or easily. But when it did come, it was worth the effort. My phone rang less frequently with HOA horror stories as time went on, partly because word had spread that Sunset Hills had cleaned up its act, and partly because other communities were learning from our example. The HOA industry as a whole was starting to take notice of the fact that homeowners were no longer willing to accept abuse in the name of property values. I still got the occasional call from someone dealing with an unreasonable board, and I still gave advice when I could. But I also referred people to the growing network of attorneys and homeowners' rights advocates who were making this their specialty. I'd done my part. It was time to let others carry the torch. One evening, about 2 years after everything started, I was having dinner with Richard and some other neighbors when someone asked me if I regretted buying a house in an HOA community. I thought about it carefully before answering. No, I said finally. HOAs can serve a legitimate purpose. They maintain common areas, organize community events, and help preserve property values when they're run properly. The problem isn't the concept of an HOA. The problem is when small-minded people get a little bit of power and forget that they're supposed to be serving their neighbors, not ruling over them. Richard raised his glass. To holding the powerful accountable. I'll drink to that, I said, and we all clinked glasses. Later that night, as I sat on my patio watching the stars come out over the Arizona desert, I thought about how different my retirement had turned out from what I'd planned. I'd expected peace and quiet and golf. Instead, I'd gotten a legal battle, a criminal prosecution, and a statewide reform movement. But I wouldn't have changed it. Brenda Morrison had tried to bully me into submission, assuming that I was just another homeowner who would pay whatever fine she demanded and fall in line. She'd had no idea that she was picking a fight with someone who'd spent 20 years dealing with people exactly like her, who knew every trick in the book and every loophole in the law. Her mistake had been assuming that because she had a title and some perceived authority, she was untouchable. My career had taught me that nobody is untouchable when they're breaking the law and hurting people. It just takes someone with the knowledge and the willingness to stand up and fight back. I'd been that person for Sunset Hills, and it had made all the difference. The desert night air was cool and comfortable, and I could hear the distant sound of coyotes calling to each other in the hills. Inside my house, everything was quiet and peaceful. My front door was still the same color it had been when I moved in, and I still only had 2 agave plants in my front yard instead of 3. And nobody, absolutely nobody, was going to find me for it. The community had learned a valuable lesson about the difference between legitimate governance and petty tyranny. The HOA board now operated with transparency and accountability, treating homeowners with respect and following the law. Property values were up, satisfaction was high, and the only person who'd lost out was the one who'd abused her position in the first place. That seemed like justice to me. I finished my drink and headed inside, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. Retirement, I'd learned, wasn't about avoiding challenges or hiding from conflict. It was about having the freedom to choose which battles were worth fighting and the wisdom to know when to stand your ground. Brenda Morrison had given me a battle worth fighting, even if she hadn't meant to, and in the end, everyone was better off for it, except for her. Sometimes, I reflected as I turned off the lights and headed to bed, the universe has a funny way of making sure people get exactly what they deserve. Brenda had wanted power and control. She'd ended up with a criminal conviction and a ruined reputation. I'd wanted peace and quiet. I'd ended up with a reformed community, grateful neighbors, and the satisfaction of knowing I'd made a real difference. Not a bad trade-off at all.